Welcome to the Politics and Media programme. Prime Minister David Cameron has announced a drive to increase the number of black and Asian parliamentary candidates for the Tory party. The announcement comes in the wake of the hammering that Mitt Romney received at the hands of a wide spectrum of black, Asian and Hispanic voters in the US presidential election. Leading Tories are concerned that the party's inability to win votes from black and ethnic minority voters may cost them the next general election. But Tory MP Mark Pritchard has warned against what he calls an ethnic beauty parade of black and Asian candidates. So is Cameron's plan worthless tokenism or a brave attempt to challenge the Tory traditionalists? With me in the studio are Owen Jones, columnist at The Independent and author of Chavs, The Demonization of the Working Class, Professor Shamit Saggar, Professor of Politics at the Sussex University, and Mohammed Amin, Vice Chair of the Conservative Muslim Forum. Welcome to the programme, all of you. Mohammed, is this a worthwhile operation? Will it help the Tories vote in the next election?
Well, to win, the Conservative Party needs to appeal to every part of the country, working class, middle class, upper class and all ethnic minorities. And to the extent that we're not reaching enough ethnic minorities, clearly we need to reach more of them.
Shamit, Paul Goodman of the Conservative Home website wrote in the Telegraph recently that the Tories have lost the next general election, and he cited this reason, the inability to get votes from these communities, as part of the problem. Do you think it's as serious as that for the Tories?
It's fairly serious. In 2010, the Conservatives failed to have an outright majority against the most favourable backdrop you could imagine, a very unpopular Labour government. A Labour government that presided over two issues, immigration and the economy, which are prone to be rather disastrous in the views of the voters. And so for the Conservative Party, they're looking under every stone at this stage to think about how they could sort of reinvigorate their electoral prospects. The trouble is actually with minority voters, the sort of past legacy is not that great. The Conservative Party, for a variety of reasons, have never done terribly well when it comes to black and Asian voters in this country. And that's despite many false dawns and many false starts. So many things can be considered to try to take forward the Conservative course amongst minority voters. But in particular, this proposal about getting more black and Asian MPs into the House of Commons strikes me as being a little bit sort of narrow, if not quite tokenistic.
Owen, I mean, it must be good news to you to hear that the Tories are in this much trouble. But sort of standing back from it, could the Tory party develop a strategy which might at least get more votes out of the black and Asian middle class, even if they kind of take the view that there aren't that many kind of votes among the BME working class communities to be got?
It's possible, but there were formidable challenges, and I'd certainly agree the Tories face a real crisis of epic proportions. I mean, their vote has been in decline for two generations. Every time they've won an election since 1955 has been on a lower share of the vote than the time before. The last election handed to them on a plate, Labour government less popular than cholera, and the biggest economic crisis since the 1930s, and they still could not win. And they face a similar challenge that the Republicans face in the United States, which is, whilst the BME population has increased, they've struggled to make those sorts of inroads. But the point about the Conservatives and why they struggle is, I think, goes down to the nature of what the Conservatives are. I'd argue they exist as the political wing of the wealthiest elements in society. I remember when I was a student, which is probably a bit further away than many of your viewers might think from looking at me, but I attended an off-the-record speech by a very senior Conservative politician. He said, what you have to remember about the Conservatives is that they are a coalition of privileged interests. They exist to defend that privilege, and the way they win elections is by giving just enough to just enough other people. The problem is, for the Conservatives, is those privileged interests tend to be, well, pretty white. And in terms of the people who disproportionately suffer from Conservative policies, not least in the era of cut, where working people, the working poor, are facing a hammering, that people from ethnic minorities are likely to be overwhelmingly represented amongst those victims. I'll give you an example. Over half of Muslims in this country of either Bangladeshi or Pakistani extraction live in poverty. They live on wages of less than £7 an hour if they're in work. These are people who will be hammered, for example, by cuts to tax credits. What possible motivation would they have to vote for this party?
I mean, Shamit, do you think that this is a problem that the Tories would have in trying to develop a kind of class-based strategy aimed at some sections of black and ethnic minority communities? I guess what Owen is suggesting there is that that's a narrower section of British society than it might be in the States, where, I mean, Mitt Romney obviously failed to do that, but some Republicans in the past have succeeded.
I mean, the great sort of puzzle about all this is why the British middle-class party historically has failed to do better amongst middle-class minorities. Middle-class minorities have been growing in number, steadily, Asians more so than blacks. And yet, the overwhelming evidence shows that their ethnic background, ethnicity if you want, trumps class. And so why is this party unable to gather middle-class voters who happen to be Asian or black? And I think it's a pretty tough sort of question to sort of Conservative Party to face up to. And the fact of the matter is, even now, sort of 40 plus years since Powell, the party still has a kind of residual sort of, element of being tainted by people who see the country very much in terms of being sort of white and Anglo-Saxon. Now, the funny thing is, I think the country's changed substantially. The recent census figures shows that ethnicity is not just something that's confined to sort of minorities in inner cities. People are now spreading out. The growth in the minority population has been substantial. So the parallel between us and the United States is a very valid one. But it goes back to, in my view, a very straightforward sort of test. Why can't a middle-class party gather middle-class votes? And we see that middle-class minorities, particularly Asians, their appetite to vote for the Conservative Party goes down very dramatically, even though amongst their white counterparts it stays up possibly, quite well. And that's where I disagree with Owen, which is that although he's describing the party as facing a pretty, daunting task, let's not forget the 20th century was the Conservative century. For 2/3 of that century, which is only just recently over, the Conservatives either were in office or when part of a coalition in office. It was the era in which the Labour Party failed to be the electoral dominant feature of that century. And whilst it's too early to say what will happen in the future, the party's got a very straightforward challenge to gather middle-class votes or middle-class interests, not so much in terms of wealth and privilege. The middle part of the middle class, as aspirational values, is substantial. After all, it's the very same part of our electoral makeup that the Labour Party under New Labour was able to appeal to and to govern for 15 years.
Mohammed, some of the commentary on these in these reports has suggested precisely what Shamit was saying, that the Tory Party has this kind of hangover, even from as far back as Enoch Powell's River of Blood speech, certainly from Norman Tebbett's The Cricket Test stuff. But isn't it missing an opportunity to overcome that by perpetuating some of the stuff which actually was very, very damaging to Labour around the war on terror, around the questions of Islamophobia? Couldn't it overcome this problem if it weren't so keen on continuing that kind of rhetoric?
Well, first of all, to build on what Shamit's just said, in April of 2012, Lord Ashcroft published a report based upon large amounts of private polling and also focus groups, which confirmed that, as Shamit has said, that the Conservative Party at the moment has a problem reaching middle-class Asian voters. And we can come back to working-class voters separately. However, things are changing. If you look at the 2010 general election, we now have a significant number of Conservative MPs from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is that Enoch Powell's old seat, Wolverhampton West I think it is now held by a Conservative Sikh MP, Paul Uppal. And that is a sign of how things are changing. Unfortunately, it takes time for people out there amongst ethnic minorities to realise that the Conservative Party has changed, and the Conservative Party itself needs to be more emphatic at demonstrating how it's changed.
I mean, one of the things that your book Chavs is about the way in which working class people are represented in the media and so forth. Do you think that part of the problem here might be not just the kind of hangover that Shamit was suggesting and that some of the reports have done from the kind of, well, let's put it plainly, more racist statements by members of the Tory party in the past, but that the weight of the trade union movement and the left in British society has historically been greater than in the United States, and that this acts as a kind of gravitational pull, even on those sections of the communities who become middle class or middle class.
Partly, I think that's certainly true. I mean, one of the important points to make, though, in terms of, if you like, working class Toryism, has actually been in steep decline itself. That's really underpins Tory decline. So the inability of Tories to win votes in working class communities, working class people, regardless of their background. The heyday of working class Toryism was actually the 1950s, not the 1980s, as some might argue, when the anti-Tory vote was split. The Tories used to win in places like Scotland. Over half of Scots voted Conservative Conservative in 1955. They used to have MPs in Liverpool, Sheffield, Manchester, and so on. They're now incapable of winning in those seats, which is why, basically, at the last election, they hit a glass ceiling, despite everything basically being laid out for them. The election was theirs to lose, which they did, that they couldn't win because of that glass ceiling effect. So I think if I was a Conservative strategist, what I would do is try to appeal to people, I suppose, on the basis of class interest, that you would try and win so-called aspirational middle class people from, regardless of their background. The reality is Cameron's incapable of doing that, not just because of the hangover effect we've been talking about. Let's not forget Cameron had a big speech last year critiquing what he called multiculturalism. That, as soon as he has a speech like that, it instantly taps into a deep folk memory which exists in many communities. It brings back these memories, this hangover, if you like. It brings back this sense that the Tories do not stand for people like me. They're dominated by white people from the most privileged sections of society who don't have the interests of our communities at heart.
Shamit, do you think that this strategy, if it stood a chance of working, do you think it still stands a chance of working when we're in the kind of era of austerity that we're in? Because surely one precondition of winning the support of the middle classes, from whatever background, is that you don't destroy bits of the welfare state that they, as well as many working class people, rely on. And yet that seems to be a part of government policy. I
mean, it certainly doesn't make it any easier. And the task is made that much harder. But let me go slightly backwards on this. I mean, where I would probably disagree with Owen is on this question of how much credit should be given to the current Conservative Party leadership in terms of turning around things that have been sort of kicking around for a very long period of time. And I think in all fairness, you'd have to say from 2005 onwards, under Cameron's leadership, there's been a concerted attempt, in fact the only attempt that I can think of that, you know, that's amounted to anything, to fundamentally rebrand and detoxify the party. Now, it's been true on some issues more than others. The party has achieved kind of a breakthrough, I think, in terms of its gender representation, particularly on parliamentary seats and as well on issues more generally. And also the party is now much more likely not to tolerate backbenchers who regularly in the past would get up and sort of provoke a race row, you know, John Townsend and so on, would sort of make all sorts of inflammatory remarks. I think that would happen tomorrow. It's much more likely the Conservative Party leadership will be quite tough on these things. The difficulty is that these are sort of too little too late. They're not enough to sort of turn around a sort of what Owen describes as a kind of a folk memory. But you have to sort of put this in context. This is a leadership that's trying to get on with that task. And where I would quibble with them and sort of actually criticise the strategy is that it sometimes reminds you of past initiatives of the Conservative Party, which sort of assumed the way to get ethnic minority votes is to appeal to the ethnicity of ethnic minorities. In other words, it's the only prism through which you would do so. In 1977, the Conservative Party established the Anglo-West Indian Friendship Society and the Anglo-Asian Friendship Societies. These were kind of tea and samosa type of approaches, you know, deal with people on the basis of their ethnicity. And so we've had these sort of things for many, many years. And it goes back to the question of, if there are class interests for a solid middle-class party to represent, it should be articulating those, and it should be doing so particularly for voters who happen to be from an ethnic minority background. So it's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. The question of austerity, I think, makes it much more difficult right across the board. Lots of marginal voters are looking for a kind of silver lining on sort of the gloom and doom of economic news. I think at this stage, in all fairness, it's a little bit too early to be definitive in terms of whether Osborne's austerity strategy will come good. Remember in 1983, the last time a Conservative government was in a similar position, even the smallest green shoots of recovery, to use an expression that was used at the time, was sufficient to turn around economic expectations. Middle-class households assumed on the back of some good economic news that the Conservative Party was going to be the party to go with. I'm not drawing a parallel for today, but I'm simply making the point that actually austerity is not quite done. We don't quite know whether or not it's going to work. And it's going to be premature to write off the party on that issue alone.
No, but what we do know about austerity, on its own terms, I'd argue it's been a failure, not least because growth has been sucked out of the economy and borrowing's increasing. But the point in terms of the impact on people, the Resolution Foundation, a very well-respected think tank, projects that by 2020, the average Briton will be poorer than the turn of the century, that lower earners will be 15% poorer by the end of the decade than they are now. Now, actually, disproportionately, that will impact BME people in Britain. Britain who tend to be overrepresented amongst lower income families. So I do think, regardless of whether or not there is so-called economic good news, even though at the moment we're on the brink of a triple dip recession, when as things stand, the longest economic crisis on record, it's longer in terms of a recovery than the Great Depression of the 1930s. Despite all that, people will still feel poorer, well, they'll be poorer in 2015, barring a miracle, and that will make it harder to win working class voters in the way they did in the past, but also BME people from working class communities too.
Well, so what do you think about that argument that the recession this time is simply too long and too deep to have the kind of 1983 effect that
I really want to make 2 points. First of all, Owen's friends left us with an enormous mess and a massive deficit due to Gordon Brown's overspending that had to be dealt with. And secondly, despite that, over the last 2.5 years since this government came to power, the private sector has created over 1 million new jobs. The cuts that are needed are in the public sector. But despite that, there have been actually more private sector jobs created than have been lost in the public sector.
Well, OK, but if it's so good, why is there all this sort of massive gloom in the Tory party about the prospects of the next general election?
Well, first of all, it takes time for these economic changes to work their way through. Owen can laugh, but it does. I mean, you can't turn a supertanker in a day, and we inherited the biggest mess since the early 1930s.
Let's be clear about what's happened. I mean, firstly, let's be clear that we have a deficit not as a result of overspending. In fact, the Conservatives backed Labour spending plans pound for pound until the end of 2008. We have it because of the failure, not least to regulate the banks, because New Labour embraced the sort of neoliberal economics which Thatcherism established in the first place. But the problem I have in terms of, and this is the problem your party faces, is the way the deficit is being paid off. It's being paid off disproportionately off the backs of the working poor, the unemployed, and off the backs of BME populations who tend to be BME people who tend to be amongst the groups most affected by austerity. So the issue isn't about clearing up this mess. It's about how this on whose terms has this crisis ended and who pays to end the crisis. And that is why I believe, and I think we'll see at the next election, your party will find it very difficult, if not impossible, to win over substantial numbers of working class or BME people.
I think one thing you can say, in all fairness, I mean, I think it's too early to tell, but one thing would unite us would be to say that if you're running an austerity package where we have been over the last 2 or 3 years, there certainly are more sensitive ways to have sort of implemented that, taking into account the strapline, which is we're all in it together. You know, with their time again, there would have been a better way to do that, because the effect of that is that, as Owen's pointing out, the reputation of the Conservative-led coalition is one in which it's not seen as being especially sensitive to the position of the most vulnerable in our society. So that probably will hurt it, whether these green shoots come through or not. But John, with your permission, let's just turn it around. Let's assume the economy doesn't come good and the Conservative Party is scrabbling around for votes. In the past, this will be a good test of this debate. In the past, we'll say, well, the Conservative Party will look towards other issues, which are so-called soft issues for itself. Well, right up there will be our friend immigration. The Conservative Party polls well on it, did well in 2010, always has to straddle this question of being tough on immigration but not being perceived to being sort of quasi-racist. And I think it'd be a perfect experiment to figure this out, whether Mohammed's party, when push comes to shove, when facing a likely defeat, but I'm not definitive on it at this stage, whether it will be, in a sense, forced back into past habits of saying, well, let's just remind the white electorate, the white xenophobic or racist electorate, about the fact that we are tough on immigration, which oftentimes is sort of seen as a code for keeping out black and brown people. It'd be a wonderful way of sort of figuring out whether or not there's something in this.
Well, let's address that a bit, because I mean, everybody in the commentary, and I hope we'll be talking to Nigel Farage in the second half of the programme. And OK, so they've got this problem. There's UKIP on their flank as a kind of traditional Tory party in exile operation. Is that a likely response that Shamit?
Immigration has stopped being a racial issue. Let me share with you an experience that I had when I was sitting in party headquarters before the 2010 election doing telephone canvassing, and I was phoning households in West London near sort of Heathrow Airport, and you can tell by the names and by the accents when you ring them whether they're from ethnic minorities. And I was asking them what issues were important to them, and enormous numbers of people from an ethnic minority background were telling me that one of their prime concerns was immigration. Immigration isn't a code word for the race issue anymore. It's an issue in its own right, regardless of where immigrants are coming from. Are we getting the right kind of people coming to our country? It is no longer a racial issue.
What do you reckon to that? Do you reckon that do you reckon the dog whistle is still heard?
I think when the Conservatives talk about it, I think instinctively that's what people think. I mean, it's certainly true that if you talk about anti-immigrant backlash in this country, I believe social and economic insecurities fuel that. For example, the failure of New Labour to build council housing, leaving 5 million people on social housing waiting lists. People then felt, and the far right exploited this, there's not a lot of housing to go around, so why is it being given to people like that? Now, I met people, I remember on the doorstep in 2010, people from ethnic minority backgrounds who would make that point about immigrants. So that's certainly true. There is a social and economic insecurities that fuel it. The reality is, when the Tories talk about immigration, I do think because of this folk memory, because of whether it be Enoch Powell or whether it be more recently David Cameron talking about multiculturalism in the way he speaks about multiculturalism, I think people will be very suspicious, and justifiably so, in BME communities.
So, Shamit, you raised this question about, you know, if austerity isn't ended, if the economy doesn't come good, then there's this possibility of the Tories re-raising some of these more traditional concerns which don't play very well with BME communities. But on the political level, do you see UKIP as a threat to them that's going to drive them in this direction as well?
Well, the temptation would be precisely that. The Conservative Party is operating on a very narrow base with very few raw materials and controlling very few levers. So I think we've already established that. It's not sort of an ideal situation. But whether or not it particularly bangs the drum of being sort of Eurosceptic, talk of a referendum in or out, and yet sort of advising the great British public to remain in while sort of raising the issue and having a referendum, it seems to be pointing in two different directions at the same time. Talking about immigration and clamping down on immigration, at the same time not sort of, you know, using a dog whistle and incentivising racist voters. All these things are quite difficult sort of balancing acts to pull off. But I would go back and say I would stress that under the current leadership, this question of, as it were, making the party more inclusive, both from a social point of view, a cultural point of view, an ethnic point of view, you may criticise it, you may not like it, you may say it's not gone as far as it should have, but by comparison with what happened in the Conservative Party for several generations until 2005, I think it's been considerable progress.
Well, I mean, let's be clear there. I mean, it's dominated the Conservatives by the sort of leadership which wouldn't look out of touch in a 19th century cabinet, overwhelmingly white, disproportionately drawn from the wealthier sections of society. 21 out of 29 cabinet members are millionaires. Even the A-list candidates which they promoted are overwhelmingly from pretty upper middle class backgrounds, leading right-wing critics like, for example, Peter Hitchens to criticise Cameron on that basis. So I'm not sure.
Let me just bring Mohammed back into the conversation.
But the thing that the voters are interested in 2010 and 2015 won't be particularly the postcode of a cabinet minister, though I think it's interesting. They'll be interested in the competency of a Conservative-led coalition. Can they deliver against the promises they make?
But your point is that they become more inclusive. And I don't think
just bring Mohammed back in because we're moving towards the end. Would you say to Cameron, look, there are going to be these pressures on you, the kind that Shamit and Owen have talked about, stick to the liberalisation of the party, so to say?
Absolutely, and Shamit is completely right. Since 2005, David Cameron has been busy transforming the party, its attitudes to people from ethnic minorities, its attitudes to people who are gay, for example. The Conservative Party has changed, but it takes time for people to notice. And I want to come back to something else.
We're going to have to stop there, I'm afraid, because that's all we've got time for in the first half of the programme. We'll be pursuing some of these discussions in the second half, so do rejoin us for the second part of the Politics and Media programme.